Welcome to Mandela, Struggle for Freedom. In this 4-part series, we will be exploring that struggle for freedom.
The world took notice of the injustices in South Africa early on in the apartheid system. India called the UN's attention to the poor treatment of its people in South Africa the year before apartheid legalized their existing sentiments. But it wasn't until the 1952 Defiance Campaign that the world really started to take notice of the systemic discrimination in South Africa. The UN then declared that the racial laws of South Africa were an international concern.
The global concern increased following the Sharpeville massacre in 1960, when what started out as peaceful protests turned violent when overwhelmed police opened fire on the crowd of unarmed protesters. The global community was shocked to see such an aggressive response to a peaceful, if vocal, crowd. While the global outcry against Sharpeville was short-lived on the world stage, it did create an increased awareness that the apartheid system of government was a larger issue than previously thought. The UN noted apartheid as a threat to world peace and security.
The following year, South Africa withdrew from the Commonwealth of Nations due to the criticism of other members. Canada's Prime Minister at the time, Diefenbaker, was one of the vocal opponents of South African policies.
Attention returned to South Africa during the Rivonia trial. This trial happened during a time of intense government crackdown on underground liberation movements in South Africa and its surrounding countries. The UN Security Council condemned this trial, along with other trials that targeted anti-apartheid leaders such as Vuyisile Mini. The Council also called for sanctions to be placed on South Africa.
The world continued to watch as the racial violence intensified in South Africa in the 1960s. Calls from the UN for sanctions continued, and a special council was set up in 1966 to investigate apartheid concerns. The UN drew attention to South Africa by declaring March 21st, the day of the Sharpeville massacre, the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. The UN would continually call for stronger sanctions against South Africa, and in 1982 declared the International Year of Mobilization for Sanctions against South Africa.
There was also a call for the global community to boycott cultural, academic, and sporting events associated with South Africa. Starting in 1964 and continuing until 1992, South Africa was banned from participating in the Olympic Games. The boycotts also called on musicians and artists to refuse tours and visits to South Africa. Musicians from around the world joined groups such as Artists Against Apartheid and Artists United Against Apartheid to host concerts and create songs that would generate millions of dollars to aid anti-apartheid groups. Many of these artists would also actively promote the call to free Mandela.
Here in Canada, Canadians grew more vocal against the apartheid regime, joining in on optional boycotts or attending protests. Glenn Babbs, the South African Minister to Canada, as pictured here, was often protested while attending speaking engagements at universities such as Toronto and Queen's.
The global community came together during this time to support the end of the apartheid racial system. By the fall of the apartheid government, a global network of thousands of groups and organizations existed in more than 100 countries around the world. The call to free Mandela was wide-reaching, with 20,000 mayors on every continent signing petitions to have Mandela released. Others declared Mandela a free man in their cities, and yet others named buildings, gardens, and streets after him.
While apartheid began in 1948, it was built on a long and tumultuous history of racial discrimination.
Unfortunately, this legacy of systemic racism did not fall with the apartheid government.
Nor has it been localized to South Africa.
However, we can see from the story that standing in solidarity with the oppressed and fighting for equity together can have a lasting impact. We hope you've enjoyed visiting Mandela, Struggle for Freedom, for our history in focus.